Hi, my name is Natalie Castro, and I will be presenting my text mining project where I look at the polarization of proposed federal bills and news headlines. By 2030, climate change's impact on high temperature days will double, but only 61% of United States adults are concerned about global warming or climate change. Concern about climate change is not new either. It has received increasing media and partisan attention dating into the late 1980s. Since 2008, the number of high-temperature days have tripled, which decreases overall well-being, specifically in countries who have less GDP or growing economies. Climate change disproportionately impacts the global south, thus allowing for its intense politicization in the United States. People who are not immediately impacted may have less incentive to take action which mitigate climate change. However, this is rapidly changing. Increased polarization has been identified for the past 25 years in research identifying that Americans' opinions on environmental issues has increased association between an individual's political identity and their opinions on the environment generally. This shift coincides with a time where in the United States, climate change is increasingly an issue. In 2024, the US spent over $25 billion responding to climate-related disasters. And despite this increase, political polarization furthers a deep-rooted divide. This polarization impacts the way that climate policy is negotiated and viewed at both the regulation and interactional levels. Many scholars identify the most salient factor in one's belief in climate change and its legitimacy is one's own partisan affiliation. Through this, my research project has two goals. First, how is climate change represented in climate policy passed at the federal level? The second, what ways do news coverage reflect polarization in regards to climate change? The first question aims to explore the way policy is used to institutionalize polarized debates. I'd like to explore more in depth about how different states pass laws and different topics of concerns. This has three main implications. The first is to understand how political polarization is constructed at a federal level. Through text mining methods, if it becomes clear that there is a difference in partisan affiliation, it may provide insight into what common ground can be coalesced on and in what ways that our differences may be further contributed to through media representation and other things like that. For my method, I'll be using three different text mining methods, and I'll go into those in depth shortly. But first, I'd like to start with the data. I collected over 800 news headlines using the News API. An example of this is the Trump-Newsom fight over an alleged water restoration declaration explained. Trump claimed Newsom's refusal to sign the document led to a water shortage during the Los Angeles fires, but there's more to the story. This was then converted into counts, and the labels I used were the party that was named, so this was generated through the News API, and then the publisher from which it's from. My second source of data is the proposed climate bills. So this may be any type of resolution, so concurrent, either just a simple resolution, and this dated all the way back to 1970s, all of which that had been digitized. This resulted in a total of 3,600 different bills and resolutions. These might not have all been passed, but they were proposed and they contemplated their importance in the construction of climate policy. These bills were read in as just basic text, and the labels used here were bill sponsor affiliation, bill sponsor state. So if your local representative from Colorado was a Democrat and they proposed the bill, this would all be preserved. In addition, it was a hearing committee, so who or what entity was responsible for deciding what the kind of parameters of the bill should be, and then the bill type, so this could be originating from the House, the Senate, and things like that. This was processed in a similar way and cleaned through just generating counts, and then like I noted, preserving that metadata on the side through labels. For my method, I used three core types of text mining. The first was text clustering, the next was feature identification, and the final was supervised machine learning. I'll be presenting these in aggregate here, but you're welcome to look at my website if you would look to see the specific findings from each method. I'd like to first discuss the k-means bill clustering. This turned each text into a prevalence, or what was most contained in the bill. This light green spattering illustrates how the Environmental Protection Agency was important across all of the bills. The semantic distance between the language used for climate bills were demonstrated to be close to multiple topics such as greenhouse gas and carbon dioxide, lead and contaminated drinking water, or threatened wildlife and endangered species. This prevalence demonstrates that the EPA is synonymous with different facets of climate policy. Specific partisan differences were not identified through k-means. This method demonstrated nuance within climate policy over time and to demonstrate the prevalent topics, but not necessarily in what ways different partisans or different political parties contributed to the construction of these bills. This trend was identified in both k-means clustering and latent Dirichlet allocation. The consistency across methods supports the accuracy of this finding. Through 20 different topics, it is clear that different concerns such as land, chemical regulations, and environmental factors illustrate the multiplicity and different complexities of climate regulation. Next, in considering the polarization, association rule mining was used to identify the co-occurrence between particular words. The words most associated with climate are to be expected, like climate and change. In addition, this was explored through the lens of Republican and Democrat. Government was not illustrated to be aligned in particularly with either of the political parties. However, for the Republican Party, the words associated highlight most about concerns about immigration and climate change with respect to the governmental administration. In comparison, the Democrat associations were illustrated to be aligned with words about concern for and welfare about other aspects of well-being. Affiliation was something that was able to be teased out through classification methods as well. It may demonstrate how clear or learnable the language is, which delineate partisan ideologies. A variety of methods such as support vector machines, naive Bayes, decision trees, and neural networks were used to identify how clear these language differences were and to understand the consistency across categories. Partisan affiliations were often the most correct label predicted across all the methods. So this is in comparison to publisher, sponsor state, or committee, things like that. In comparison, the proposed climate bills were predicted more consistently, so the sponsor, than that of the news articles. This finding may be in result to how the climate bills are structured. Across all models, however, it was challenging to learn the features about the independent partisan affiliation because of the few amount of training features used to teach the model. Using a classifier in this sense in the future may be able to predict the alignment of text. So if you were considering a proposal of a new bill, you may see what it's most aligned to without knowing the origin or the sponsor of the bill. This finding is true into states as well. The models were able to predict the bill sponsor state. A classifier was able to identify with relatively high accuracy the bill sponsor state, and this is illustrated through the confusion matrix having a pretty bright line through the left to right diagonal. Another method struggled to do this, though consistently, however. This suggests that either the methods were not the most appropriate to identify geographical ideological differences. However, other models were able to pick this up. In conclusion, this project illustrated how political polarization may be understood through proposed climate bills and news articles. Identified was a clear delineation between language used to speak to similar issues about climate change. In news headlines, political parties were often not named together, suggesting an opposing dialogue instead of one that is conjoined. Clustering a large corpora of bills identified a temporal understanding of climate change bills with specific named language. This means that throughout time, we may be able to track the different trends or the different concerns that are relevant through climate bills, and specifically to what party as well. This may be useful in the future to understand the placement and direction of political shifts in response to future administration changes. Thank you.